A Bit Lit, celebrating research and creativity of all kinds.
Luke, delighted to have you here. Really excited to discuss your new book, Notes on the Sonnets. Congratulations on the book. We start our films by asking contributors to introduce themselves and to tell us about their work. I guess we'd particularly like to hear about the new book. But yeah, would you mind introducing yourself, please?
Hi. Thanks for having me, Andy. I'm Luke Kennard. I'm a poet and novelist and also a lecturer in the film and creative writing department at the University of Birmingham, where I live. My first collection of poetry came out in 2005. So we've been sort of at this for 16 years now. So very much in that sort of mid-career slump where you start asking yourself why you're doing it or sort of what it is you really are trying to get out of this. But it's good. I mean, I think whether you're kind of launching a first book or you're kind of trying to write your last novel or whatever it is before you die, you're always in that existential uncertainty, really. You're always wondering what it is you really wanted to say. I think you'd probably stop. I think if you actually said what you were trying to say when you started out, then you would feel happy with ceasing. But I don't know. Yeah, I feel quite happy with where I am with writing at the moment. I feel more confident in some ways, or more like, I don't know. There are enough people who sort of get the voice or the tone or something that I feel like I can kind of push that in some ways and have some fun with that. So I'm feeling in some ways feeling like I'm just sort of starting out. I feel like I'm just starting to get better at this, and in other ways kind of it depends on the day, I suppose. Some days I feel like I've just played out and I've done everything I'm capable of doing, but I don't know. But I suppose this book kind of came out of that a little bit, came out of that impasse between trying to find the next project. I started doing this as just almost a sort of game with myself in a way. It was between projects. I've been writing quite a lot of prose poems anyway, and I had some research time, and I was supposed to be working on Jonah as a follow-up to a poetry book I did called Cain, so another kind of Old Testament character with a sort of strange take on it and a strange process for coming up with some new work and new stories around it. And it wasn't quite working. I was doing some reading and research, but the writing wasn't really happening. And I wrote the first poem in Notes on the Sonnets at a party, and at a party where I was feeling quite out of place. I generally like parties, but this was a party I'd ended up at with lots of tech bros and sort of people from the video games industry, and they were sort of, I don't know, a lot of the time they were just showing each other things on their mobile phones, and I just got quietly drunk by the oven and imagined a scenario that I was both happier and less happier in, and wrote that on my phone because everybody else was just playing on their phones. And then I just carried on really from there. I started with the Sonnet 66 and just kind of carried on picking sonnets more or less at random and trying to pick the less well-known ones and just trying to test out this method. Like, can I just read these sonnets, read them over a couple of times, familiarize myself with the notes a little bit, and the notes in whatever given text you have, maybe read around them a little bit if the sonnet is at first obscure. Some of them do feel really obscure when you first read them, and then just try and improvise something, or just try and take one image or one particular tone of voice or even just one concept from the particular sonnet in question, and just write a little prose poem that in some way corresponds to it, that in some way reacts to it. And that quickly turned from just this nice little thing I was doing to try to just break kind of deadlock I was feeling with writing into my usual way, into something that was just completely obsessive. It was like, I'm going to do all 154 and I'm not going to stop until I've done all 154, and I'm going to do like 2 a day minimum until I've finished. And that produced really uneven results. There were some poems that I was really delighted with, and usually if I was happy with it, because I was just thirsty for attention, I would like post it on Twitter straight away. So that became part of the process in a way. Every few weeks or so, I'd write one I was happy with and post it on Twitter. And then just kind of stuck to it until I had 154, and then wasn't sure what to do with them. Knew that at least 2/3 of them needed completely rewriting or reapproaching, but it was a kind of improvisatory enough technique that felt okay. It felt fine just to be like, some of these don't work, scrap them, have another run at the same sonnet. With some, I did like 6 or 7 different attempts at a response to the sonnet in question, and some of them kind of came out all right the first time.
Great, thank you. If it is a slump, it's a very impressive one, I have to say. And I love the idea of writing it in the midst of tech prose. At the start of the book, you talk about, you kind of introduce the reader to the book and saying that the order of the sonnets is determined by events. That's the events of a house party. But I like the idea that maybe Shakespeare himself was kind of producing some of these poems from his own versions of slumps, and perhaps surrounded by early modern tech prose. You never know. And think about how those things match onto each other. So we'll delve and we'll dive into lots of that. And I should say for a bit, listeners and viewers, we've made a film previously with the novelist Catherine Fox, who also writes her novels via blog posts and puts them up on Twitter. So if anyone's kind of interested in the kind of thing Luke is doing, I commend Catherine Fox's film to you for other kind of kinds of creative writing happening in that way. But yes, let's kind of unpick and think through some of these things. I mean, it's interesting that the title talks about notes on the sonnets, and it gives us Shakespeare's alarming eyes peeking out at us on the cover, but actually the title isn't name checking Shakespeare. And so the books there he is staring at me, terrifying. I never thought I'd have a Zoom call with Shakespeare. Yes, kind of Shakespeare's kind of strange presence here. I'm really interested to talk to you about the kind of Shakespeare Kennard relationships happening across the book and between the poems. And I don't know how you feel about it, having produced this number of responses now, but I'm quite pleased I wasn't Shakespeare's friend, because can you imagine when he said, "Shall I write another sonnet?" Shall I write another play about someone called King Henry? And shall I write another sonnet? And he'd be like, "No, dude, chill out, sit down, have a sofa."
Not enough. Yeah.
Like, was Shakespeare on lockdown, do we think? Kind of the levels of thirst and the levels of neediness and pestering that some of these poems kind of manifest. I wonder what it felt like just to be in dialogue with that kind of voice across such a number of poems.
Yeah. No, that's a really good question. I think like they're quite. I think when I was initially talking to my editor Tom Chivers at Pens in the Margins about it, I was kind of saying like they're quite insolent in some ways, or impudent. I'm not sure quite which nuance I want to go for there between insolence and impudence, but I think I don't like work that is too enthralled to the great writing of the past and to the great writers of the past. Fine to be enthralled to great writing, but like the great writers, sort of turn them into these mythological figures and sort of idealize and valorize them in some way. I don't know. So I don't like poems that are like sort of pub tribute acts to the Eagles or whatever. I've always kind of found that annoying, and like it just feels like a writer trying to sort of borrow some of the glamour from a great, you know, so thought kind of great writer of the past. It's like if you're going to write something that is in dialogue with the past, then kind of mess around with it and kind of have some. You don't, yeah, you know, like I suppose I also dislike work that is completely kind of disrespectful and is just making fun of everything and just not, and actually completely shallow and not that interesting. But so I thought to kind of, you know, it would be just absurdly arrogant in a way to kind of say like, I'm going to write some new versions of these great canonical works of literature. But at the same time, like, why not pretend to be that arrogant? Why not pretend to be that ridiculous and kind of try and do that? So at times they're quite argumentative. They're quite kind of, there are things that do genuinely annoy me in the sonnets. Like there are, and there's reference in one of the pieces and one of the responses, there are so many references to wrinkles and the sort of physical kind of aging process in this really boring way, like this sort of really, like in a way that feels no more subtle or intelligent than the kind of military industrial beauty complex. You know, it's sort of they are like skin cream adverts. Some of them, it's just like the worst thing you could possibly have is a wrinkle, and it's just like, my God, like this is. So there are ways of talking and ways of thinking within the sonnets that I find stupid and wrong. So it's like, you know, you can sort of see work as great literature and still find what is stupid and wrong about it and kind of point that out. I think that's sort of part of the process, but kind of enjoy that while you're doing it as well, I guess, and just say like, well, this is like the most tedious way of seeing the aging process, from saying that your light is dimming, you are no longer the great beauty you once were. It's like, my goodness, you know, like you're almost sort of not used to. Like, people would be embarrassed to say something like that now, and rightly so. And it's like, it's sort of there. It's in this sort of classic work. But so there are things that I felt like needed critiquing, but also there are things about us and our age that need critiquing as well. So kind of in juxtaposing these sort of ways, of these different methods of analysis, these different ways of thinking, often kind of circular and frustrating ways of thinking, often demonstrably incorrect ways of thinking, that are just as prevalent now as they were in Elizabethan times, just in different ways and different nuances. That I wanted to kind of mash that together. I think there was at one point I got asked a question about the book, and I kind of described it as like, these are like the sonnets if they were narrated by one of Shakespeare's fools. So rather than the sort of wounded romantic player of the speaker of the original sonnets, it's more like, what if we introduce, because I love the fools in Shakespeare's plays, I live for those scenes if I'm reading or watching one, and that particular voice that kind of will go from kind of mocking everything to kind of deep sincerity by sentence to sentence, and has kind of, as well as being sort of the voice is sometimes quite sort of faux naive, the voice is sometimes extremely grumpy or sort of willfully obtuse. And then it also has these moments of absolute clarity. It always has these sort of moments of just a piercing insight into the rest of the play that the other characters aren't quite capable of. I realise I'm making a rather grand case for what I'm doing here, but it's like, but kind of some of those tactics, I think, the kind of tactics that Shakespeare uses in writing the fools.
Yeah.
Like, I wanted to kind of try and bring that to love poetry in a way as well, because love poetry is ridiculous and is idealized, and it's like, and is hard to write and hard to make convincing. And I think for people who haven't really spent much time reading the sonnets, they just see them as these great works of love poetry, rather than what they are, which is great works of infidelity and jealousy and sort of self-sabotage. I mean, those are the sort of the main themes really that come through when you read all 154. And the love that is expressed often isn't good. it's not great. It's often quite toxic, to use a contemporary term for that. So that felt like it needed unpacking and needed kind of worrying and writing about as well, to me.
Yeah, the writing about love in Shakespeare's poems is not often very consent focused. And you were talking about kind of the interest in wrinkles and aging, and this obsession with demanding people have children because the voice of the poem would like them to. I should say, my very first experience at a massive Shakespeare conference, went to a North American conference of 2,000 Shakespeareans in a big old theatre, a big old hotel, and the hotel was also hosting a beauty cream conference, and I kept going to the wrong rooms, expecting conversations about Shakespeare, and someone would say, "Oh, honey, your skin is terrible," and would be rubbing things in before I knew what was happening to me. So I have lived that particular poem, whereas you say Shakespeare's kind of product placement of beauty.
Yes.
Is it possible to talk a little bit more about that kind of Shakespeare-Kennard connection? And you've hinted at this already in terms of some of the prose poems are in argument or in dialogue with some of the poems. Some of them are thinking in terms of a kind of the full voice or persona from Shakespeare's plays. Like some of the prose poems seem to presuppose that the sonnet has just been read aloud, and in fact, of course, the first prose poem kind of gives us that way in. But others seem to be responding, I'm going to say simply, but I don't mean that in a demeaning way, but they're responding in a much more laser-like focused way to a particular word. And in one of them, the word seems to be the word so. In another one, the word seems to be the word the. Sometimes it would be very surprising and provocative, kind of verbal details from the sonnets, which will spark the response. Do you mind talking us through some of those different choices?
Yeah. There are, I guess there are kind of layers, because sometimes it would just be a particular location or object even, or just or an animal, so the ones, whenever a horse comes up in the sonnets, I'll be like, oh great, I can bring the sad horse and the happy horse back in now, which were just in one poem initially and then became running characters throughout it. And I would just take that as a trigger. And then still try and, I think I would just reread the poem. And especially if my response thing wasn't really working, I would go back to the sonnet again and think, okay, so what can I layer in? What can I kind of bounce ideas off in the actual sonnet? But sometimes it would be something more formal, and sometimes there's a sort of relationship to the formal structure of the sonnet, to kind of syllables, to rarely to rhyme, but sometimes to the sort of use of rhyme, or to the kind of the particular kind of rhyme that's being deployed in any given sonnet. But yes, sometimes the refrains and the repetitions as well. And the so one is very much kind of just takes off from that and builds on that. And that's, yeah, so certain things were sort of more foregrounded in the initial writing, and quite often they were sort of rapid responses. Quite often the first drafts for sure would just be like, right, read this, and then just write, just go and write. And I sort of had to find that way of making that plausible within the book as well, and making that seem like, so somehow it all taking place at this party, it all kind of happening in this place where, and it's never sort of, apart from in that first poem where the narrator meets a man who claims he's memorized all the sonnets by heart. That does come back a couple of times in, but otherwise it's sort of, they're just sort of in his head. Apart from that, there's not someone else at the party who recites a particular sonnet and then he has some thoughts about that. It's more just something happens at the party, he's introduced, so he has a conversation with somebody, he momentarily falls in love with somebody, and to him it feels pertinent to that particular sonnet. So it's kind of, so it's backwards. The speaker in the poem is doing things the other way around to what I was doing when I was writing them. Basically, the speaker in the poem is ruminating on them and thinking, this thing that's just happened makes me think of this thing in the sonnet. But it's all quite, I guess, all sort of low in the mix sometimes, and lower in the mix sometimes than others. What the links to the sonnet are. Or I could kind of, I don't know. I want to do this kind of punishing reading where I read all of the sonnets and the responses just in the order they are in this book, which would be about 4 hours, I think. Ideally, I'd like it to be in an actual theatre where people can't escape. They can just show themselves out and claim they have Wi-Fi problems.
Superb. I mean, if you don't want to do that in the theatre, we'll happily host that on a bit lit. That sounds fantastic. Yeah. Yes, please. I mean, you raised the issue of kind of form, and Shakespeare has a sonnet about 2/3 of the way through where he basically seems to be saying, oh God, why am I writing yet another sonnet? And he's not just committed to sonnets, he's committed to a very particular version of the sonnet. And you, working in a very different form, perhaps have more freedom of movement, but Shakespeare certainly doesn't take the freedom of movement that he has. He's very locked into certain kinds of quatrains and couplets and rhyming schemes, etc. Whereas your work is so much more free-flowing and experimental and explorative of the room of the space of the prose poem and the room of the sentence. The voice across the book is really wedded to kind of almost aphoristic short sentences, but also into these fabulously copious sentences, which often get hooked on particular, I don't know if it's inspired by the tech bros, but kind of, certain kinds of knowledge-based details, esoteric knowledge-based details suddenly take the voice of the poet across multiple lines in a single sentence. I'd love to hear more about the kind of formal energy of these poems.
Yeah, no, that's a really nice question. Yeah, and that is kind of the rhythm of it. I think it's something that the prose poem gives you, in a way. One of the gifts of it as a form is that modulation and that pivoting between your own different voices, but also quite in that kind of New York school kind of way, like John Ashbery and Barbara Guest, where you can just suddenly introduce another register to the poem, but through kind of careful juxtaposition, still make it flow, still have it flow. So it's like you can be just in the middle of a drunken conversation, but suddenly just something about the early church mystics or the chemical composition of boron or something, just some little segue in, and it's kind of and it's a delicate balance, because you can get that so wrong and then it just comes across as irritating, zany surrealism. It's probably my favorite writers to work with, like whether it's students or just people I'm reading a manuscript for, are people who work in that field and who work with quite sort of absurdist or surrealist narrative, because I feel like that's where I'm able to be of some help, because I can say like where it's just drifting off into something arbitrary and something that just loses the reader, because anything can happen, so therefore who cares? It loses tension. So maintaining that tension is really it's weird, and it's often something that's really sort of poem by poem, case by case. You can see where something is going wrong. You can see where it's just losing that focus. I love that example of the poem where Shakespeare is just so tired. I'm so tired of writing these sonnets. Why am I still doing this? Because that comes up in Pushkin's Eugene Onegin as well. There's about 2/3 of the way through, there's a Pushkin sonnet where he's just like, why am I doing this? I'm so sick of this. And he talks about the ducks taking off from a lake that he's strolling around, as if they too are sick of his poetry. And that sense of exhaustion I find really interesting as well. That sense of like, you commit to a project and then you have to see it through. And there are going to be many moments throughout it, like with any creative undertaking really, where you're just like, why did I start doing this? It's that moment where you just have to hold your nerve and you just have to carry on with it. You're too far in to give up at this point.
Yeah. Fascinating. This is sort of bringing me to another question, which is sort of two questions at once, so I apologize in advance. But I don't know if you're aware of this book that only recently came out, and I ended up reading your book directly after it, but Paul Ebenson and Stanley Wells have recently re-edited the sonnets, not just from the sonnet collection, but from sonnets across Shakespeare's theatrical work as well, in what they think of as a compositional order, so in the order that Shakespeare was working. So it was really nice to kind of be working with you with your narrative structure of the party, and then Paul and Stanley thinking about the narrative structure essentially of Shakespeare's life. And I was particularly kind of interested as I read your prose poems that they themselves don't have titles and don't have numbers. So I wonder, if you were to refer to one of your prose poems, how would you refer to it? How would you identify it within the space of the book? Is it the Shakespeare sonnet and its first line and the numbering of the sonnet, which would kind of pull us to a particular moment? That's sort of question one. And then question two is really about that notion of the party as narrative, and what that then brings you to. Again, you were just talking about the kind of energy that pulls a reader through a text, the tension. So kind of two questions. One a slightly dull one, and I apologize, but I'm really interested in just how we think of these poems individually and how we would refer to them, what sort of life they have outside of the apparatus of Shakespeare's sonnets. It feels like they're deliberately kind of identified by the sonnet by Shakespeare, perhaps. And then, yes, the wider narrative of your collection.
Yeah, no, I think with the physical book, now that it's out, I tend to just use the page number because that's easy, because they're all in a weird order, and they're all in this weird reactive order, which I could say some more about, but maybe I'll leave that as a stupid thing. But when I was writing them originally, they were just called Sonnet 22, Sonnet 104, Sonnet, and that was a slightly, I suppose, again, just a sort of slightly tongue-in-cheek thing in a way, because obviously they were prose poems, but and as I was just posting them online, I probably posted about 12 of them online, the ones that I was happy with. That would just be like Sonnet 6, and here's a prose poem sort of thing. The structure of the book was something I talked to my editor about quite a lot. And it was his really good, I think, decision to sort of format it more like prose fiction than like prose poetry, because I always like to kind of squash the margins with a prose poem, so it looks slightly different, it feels slightly different when I'm writing it up as well. But these are sort of, this is sort of much more like traditionally formatted as fiction in a way on the page. And it was also his decision to have the first line of the sonnet and the number in brackets. I was, rather than like a big number, which I'd originally in my original manuscript just had like large numbers above the prose poems. And it was kind of in that editorial process, really, that I was like, okay, this is really nice. It's really nice to foreground that relationship, even though the opening line of the sonnet quite often is not exactly what the prose poem is riffing on. It's still quite enjoyable. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it's direct, kind of what the prose poem references appears in that first line. Quite often it doesn't, but it's still kind of fun, even when it doesn't, to be like, okay, but how could it maybe do that? Or maybe just go, because all of the sonnets are available at the touch of a button online. So I sort of don't really have any time for people who say like, oh, do I have to read all of them? And it's like, well, they're really short. And you literally just sort of Google sonnet 123 and it's there in front of you in like several different iterations. You could be reading it right now. It would take you 25 seconds. So it's like this kind of, I never get that. I think it's like, it's sort of inverse elitist, this sort of idea that this stuff is so accessible. It's so kind of there. It's like, so why not play around with it? Why not use it? You know, you're not required to like study them, but like you might as well have a look at the original if you want to kind of get more out of the prose poem, or even just try and identify what exactly I'm on about. But I hope that they kind of stand alone as well, and I hope that they kind of work just as individual pieces. But with the party thing, that form of the party, so that's, I've talked to some friends about this quite a bit. There's something of the sense of community, the communal nature of the party, the kind of chaos in that sense, but the fact that this is a group of people put together, this is a group of people with varying opinions and subject positions who are compressed into this small space, into this same house or building or space. And maybe that polyphony, although, I mean, Shakespeare was such a sort of polyphonic and multitudinous kind of writer anyway, but there's something in that slightly sort of sealed nature of lyric poetry as it's sort of developed that is quite individualistic and is quite hermetically sealed. So just immediately blasting that open and being like, okay, so here's because I mean the original sonnets themselves, obviously, the speaker's often obsessed with what people think of him. Sometimes it's really defiant. Sometimes I don't care what you think of me. I've done really terrible things and I don't care. And other times he frets a lot over his reputation and how he's coming across and what people might be saying about him behind his back and that sort of thing, which is very human. We all do that. We all are obsessed with that sort of. But like plunging the speaker into a party where they're constantly being talked over and interrupted or trying to express something, usually failing to. One thing that was funny, and also I just think it changes. It changes the focus in a way that really interested me. It changes it explodes it outwards into something where you do actually have to, you're constantly dealing with the other or being the other. And I felt like that was a kind of intervention, but also one that was quite true to the original sequence as well.
Yeah.
In a weird sort of way.
Yeah. No, that's fantastic. That's really helpful. Luke, for reasons of time, I think we should wrap up our conversation there, but I like to think we
always talk too much. Sorry.
No, it's great. I think we have tantalized our audience who will be rushing off to read both Shakespeare and Kennard, as you've encouraged them to do, both of those kinds of reading. And we end our films by asking what the word literature means to you. You're welcome to answer that question as personally or as professionally as you like. You might want to think about what the person speaking in your book has to say about that question and a reading of Shakespeare. I don't know, but yeah, where does that word sit for you as a term?
I think, and this is maybe part of why I like the prose poem so much, but I think it's text. And that can be a text for performance or just to be read quietly or kind of both. I think some of my favorite kind of events I've been involved in have been almost quite not improv, but sort of put together quite quickly, where it's like some collaborations between writers, where you just come up with something new and then you perform it soon afterwards. It's kind of that for me kind of demythologizes the process a little bit. And obviously in my teaching job, I'm always requiring my students to respond quite quickly to things. I'll give them a prompt, I'll give them some work that we'll look at, we'll discuss, and they'll be like, right, okay, here is the concept. Write something for 15 minutes now. And really frequently, I'm really dazzled by what they come up with in a really short space of time. It's often enviably good and interesting and strange. And it's that. So sorry, my kids are squealing in the background. It's just, yeah, I think it's text. I mean, eventually you have to sort of commit to something, commit to a particular form, and just say, well, actually, this could be a novel. Even this is like a little prose poem that I came up with as a result of a writing exercise in 10 minutes, but it's got an idea in it or a character that actually could be a whole novel. And then you commit and you work on that. But I think what it means to me is just it's completely central to the way that I see the world, the way that I exist in it. It's completely, makes it sound like it's sort of a pressure valve or something like that. But it's sort of, I can't really imagine being alive and not writing. And I kind of have the privilege of working with people who feel fairly similar one way or another, and which is, and it's sort of more than just an outlet. It's that you want to create something. You want to create something that other people can lose themselves or find themselves in, and so there's that collaborative process, I think, between writer and reader always. But I think that's it. There's a really wishy-washy answer, but
it's really helpful. And when I was reading the collection, I was really enjoying reading them aloud. They're incredibly fun to read aloud.
Nice.
I had people rushing in from the room next door to make sure I was all right as I roared of laughter at various bits. And the sad talking, I was mostly laughing, but the sad horse is quite infectious. The sad horse made me sad. So thank you, but also no thank you for introducing the sad horse into my life. It's a fabulous collection, Luke. Congratulations. I'm really excited to see it out in the world. And thank you very much.
Thank you. Really appreciate it. And thanks.